Well, it's things that you really should be talking about on your first date.
Your first date? No wonder Branson does what he does.
Hey, I'll tell you, you laugh about that. So by Heather and I's third date, and we know from joking about it last time, we had a very short courtship, but in our third date, I said, hey, let's talk about your credit. Now, being in financial planning, I'm going to think that, right? So we did. We shared credit reports. We knew what debt was there. We talked about child support, all those things. But like I said, we still didn't think about, hey, who's going to pay for this or who's going to pay for that or
car insurance.
That's better than what Lori did. Lori made me show her my STD panel.
Well, we did that too. We shared. I mean, we've been married before, so it's not like.
Welcome to episode 282 of the Nacho Kids podcast.
What's up, y'all?
What's up? Okay, before I forget, December the 7th, which is a Saturday, David and I are going to be in Scottsdale, Arizona. And if you want to hang out with us, you need to shoot me an email and let me know so we can give you more information on the location and all that stuff once we know how many people are interested.
That's right.
That's right.
Yep. We got to hang out with some folks over in, where was we at last time? Denver. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yep. Had a nice dinner and conversation. It's great.
Yeah. All right. So there's that. And our guest today is a return guest, Mikel Van Cleve.
Yes.
Yes.
I enjoyed talking to Michael.
I did too. And I'm glad you were able to be there, David.
I know. How about that?
I know. Mikel was previously a guest on episode 273, and he talks about how nachoing worked in his family.
Mm-hmm.
So check that out. But this time we have Mikel talking about financial planning for blended families.
Yeah. It's an interesting conversation. And certainly I believe everybody listening to this one will probably go back and say, oh, I never thought about that. Maybe we need to have a conversation about these things. And in fact, you and I, when we got off the podcast, there's a couple things we were like, you know what? We're in a different stage of life now with the kids growing up and they're moving out, and your son's still here, but he's now an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, well, you know what? We need to revisit some of these things. We need to revisit our planning and wills and things like that, just to make sure, because like your will, it still says if something happens to you, then Jackson goes to, me or one of your friends or something like that. So it still has all that kind of stuff in there. So we need to just review those things. And I think people should review those periodically anyway.
Yeah, and that's one thing he talks about.
Yep.
All right. So, y'all, let's get to listening.
Let's do it.
Today we have Mikel Van Cleve. Hey, Mikel, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. How are y'all?
Good. Now, you've been on our podcast before, but we had you back because you are a certified financial planner.
Correct.
And you work with blended families.
I do. So I'm actually working on my doctorate in financial planning right now. And that is 100% my focus is research on blended families and money and kind of the intersection of both the psychology piece of that as well as the financial planning side.
Wow. So there is money left over after the attorneys get done?
Not a lot. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. Yeah, we need to hook you up with somebody that helps people not fight so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like us or our family wizard or whatever it is.
Yeah. Like I wish I could have invested everything that we spent on attorneys and
let's
court.
Not talk about that. Yeah. So what is one of the biggest differences you see between nuclear families and financial planning versus blended families?
The biggest difference, it's just complicated. It's a lot more complicated. There's more people involved. There's more emotions involved. You've got prior obligations in a lot of cases to ex-spouses like alimony and child support that you're not going to see in a nuclear family. That can cause friction.
Mm-hmm.
You go from possibly having no kids to, or just having your own kids to now having potentially a new spouse's kids as well, the step kids in the relationship. So there's more expenses there. I mean, the list goes on, right?
Yes.
You do not want to spend as much money on your step kids as your own kids, and that can lead to arguments. And so it's all complicated.
Do you talk to couples about whether they should join finances or not?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's a personal preference. So research shows that blended families are less likely to manage finances jointly than a nuclear family. Some will manage their finances completely separate, and some will take more of what's called a three bucket approach, which is where you have like a yours, mine, and ours. So each spouse will have their own accounts and manage some of their own expenses. That's pretty common for some of those prior obligations I talked about, like child support and alimony. And then they'll have a joint account. So that's the third bucket, right? For things like their mortgage or, utilities, things like that are more for the joint household, so to speak. So that's pretty common as well. But really, it comes down to that couple. I wouldn't want to force a couple to manage finances jointly,
Right.
even though there's other research that says couples tend to have higher relationship satisfaction and financial satisfaction when they manage things jointly.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't take into account all the dynamics of what goes on in a blended family. So there are plenty of instances where it does make more sense for a blended family to have a three bucket approach,
Right.
or completely separate. So,
Yeah, I think for us, we kind of had the multiple bucket approach.
Multiple bucket.
Even though we didn't.
But our
I
money is
guess
together.
it is together, but like child support, we didn't
Oh, yeah.
consider child support family funds.
Right. It went into a separate account to be
Yeah.
used for my son.
Right. Yeah.
Sure.
So for me, I didn't pay child support, nor did I receive child support. So that was not something we dealt with on my side. But on her side, even from the beginning, I told her that your child support is for your son, and whatever that encompasses, it's not part of the family budget. So let's not look at that money and let's not take it into account when we're doing our budgeting or anything else.
Yeah, because when you half of it would go to attorney's fees.
Yeah, we were kind of on the flip side of that in my family. So my wife did not pay or receive child support, but until recently, we now have my daughter here full time. So I have custody of her, but for the majority of the time, I was paying child support. And so that did cause some friction because we tried to do everything joint at first. And then we learned, hey, let's go to the three buckets. So I started having child support come out separately. And that made Heather feel better because she didn't have the stress of seeing that happen. Made me feel better too, because it was kind of over here and not part of our normal bill account. So
yeah. I mean, it's difficult to navigate because I don't know that we really looked at like every single detail of spending and said anything that you spend on Jackson has to come out of child support. I mean, I don't think we did that. I'm
No.
sure that our joint funds bought, normal clothing and certainly his food. And there was just a lot of stuff that probably did just come out of the joint thing. But when it was something that was very kind of hyper specific to him, and then it came out of that
Medical bills. Actually,
Yeah.
clothes. I did take.
Did you?
Yeah, anything
Yeah.
like that. Now, Michael, you and Heather both have one kid?
no, we have two each.
Okay.
It's just only two of them live with us. The other two are older. So.
Okay. I couldn't remember. I apologize for that. Do you, like with my instance or my situation, I had one kid. Jackson has four.
Jackson. You
Jackson.
mean David? We hope Jackson doesn't
No,
have any
Dave.
kids.
David has four. So I see it a lot in blended families, and I'm sure you see it too, where somebody's like, but they've got three more kids than I do. I shouldn't have to pay the same percentage. Their kids here 95% of the time. Mine's only here every other weekend. So, I mean, we've seen it where people break down grocery bills. This was your kids, this was my kids, and then they split it that way. Then it's, oh, well, the power bill is split between six people. Four of them are you and your kids, two are me and mine. So I'm only responsible for, and it gets so crazy.
Yeah, it can get really complicated. I mean, there's scenarios, I can't talk today, where people will just split it 50-50. But then not only can that feel unfair to one side because of the number of people involved, but also because incomes can differ.
Mm-hmm.
So if one person earns a lot more income than the other, then that 50-50 on expenses is disproportional, right, towards the one that earns less income. So some folks will do it based on percentage of income. And so they'll split it up that way, right? So if I'm 40% of the household income and Heather's 60% of the household income, then she would cover 60% of the expenses and 40% me, right?
Right.
Or, to what you guys talked about, it could be that, a family might say, okay, well, there's 4 of you and 2 of me, you're going to pay the majority of it, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Pay 2/3 of it. So I think it's really about what does that couple feel more comfortable with? There's no one size fits all, right? I started to say what that couple feels fair, but let's be honest, there's no fairness in a blended family. So
There's no fairness in a nuclear family.
Yeah.
That's true too. So
Honestly, if you really look at most things in life, there is no such thing as fair.
Mm-mm.
I mean, it's just
but it's more unfair in a blended family.
It's even more unfair. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even look at the word in the vernacular. Just forget it. There's no such thing. It's really more about what's going to work that you both agree on. That's not going to cause a problem, and that's what you go with, and you don't worry about the whole fair thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course,
agree.
We've realized that usually when people are nitpicking the grocery list or the grocery bill, well, the mac and cheese was for your kid and this was for mine. There's more to it.
Yeah, that's not the problem.
Right.
That's the symptom of a larger issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it is difficult. I like, so Ron Dill, who's an author I'm sure y'all are familiar with, he does a lot in the blended family space. And, they had an idea in one of the books that he did that they call it togetherness plan. And I like that term because that's what it's about. It's about coming together, right, in this blended family. But the togetherness plan is a way to document these are the things that we're comfortable with. This is how we're going to manage these different expenses. This is how we're going to handle these different things and assets and so forth. And then particularly when you get to thinking about later in life, hopefully, and not anytime soon, but when one spouse or the other passes, what are we going to do from an estate planning perspective? And that's another area where blended families are so much more complicated in many cases than nuclear families. Because in a nuclear family, you can just say, "Hey, I'm gonna leave behind my retirement funds and my assets and all these things to my spouse, and then when my spouse passes, it'll just go to our kids or whatever." Right?
Mm-hmm.
In most cases. Well, if you do that in a blended family, if I leave everything, or say Heather leaves everything to me, and she passes away, then I pass away, and we haven't set things up correctly. Guess who it's going to? It's going to my kids, and her kids get nothing.
Right.
And so you don't want to unintentionally disinherit a kid. And so, obviously having the right estate planning documents drawn up with an attorney and all that's important, but you can start by having those conversations as a couple and documenting that in this so-called togetherness plan. So.
Right. And it's important to talk about these things prior to marriage or prior to
death.
Together.
You should talk about it.
I heard of death. But the more you deal with in the beginning, the less you have to deal with throughout the process.
Well, not only that, but in the beginning, people tend to not have all the blended family issues in the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So that's a great time to figure these things out.
Right.
Before there's problems, and then you can't really even sit down and have these conversations. And then there's a lot of, even if you can, there's so much animosity and hurt that takes years to get over.
Right. Yeah, no, it's, and that's the thing. Unfortunately, statistics show that most people don't talk about it before they get married, mm-hmm. blended or nuclear. But as we know, it's much more of an issue even in the blended family space. But there's also a lot of things you just don't think about if you've not been in a blended family type of arrangement before. Simple things like I'm going to get my kids a cell phone when they're teenagers, right? Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? It's no longer a decision just between you and your spouse necessarily, because you may need to talk to your ex, the parent's your kid's other parent, about that, because that's a pretty big decision. They may have different feelings or beliefs about what age a kid should get a cell phone. So something so simple becomes more difficult. Mm-hmm. And then what if there's other kids in that household? What if your ex has remarried or is cohabiting with someone else, and so your kids have step siblings in the other house? Mm-hmm. Is it fair to them? Here's the fair word again, right? if your kid gets a cell phone and theirs doesn't, right? Especially if they're around the same age. And so there's just all these other factors and variables. So it's kind of like if you don't know what you don't know.
Mhm.
So I didn't even think to talk about some of that stuff, right? Or,
Right.
and then there's bigger things like what if one spouse comes in with 529 plans, for example, set up for college funding for their kids, and the other spouse has nothing.
Right.
I came across an article the other day. I got one of those Google notification alerts, right? Like your name's popped up on Google. And someone quoted me, and I had never talked to them, but the issue that came up there is that a couple had gotten married. They had this blended family. One, that was the situation. They had education funds set up and the other didn't. Well, the spouse that didn't have that stuff in place felt like that money should be shared equally with all the children, right? And obviously you can't just share a 529 plan with everyone like that. There's rules, but the spirit being, hey, everyone should get some of this college funding. Otherwise, my kids have to go borrow. And the spouse that had set those things up said, hey, it's not my fault you didn't do any of this stuff before we met.
Right.
And why should my kids have to suffer and borrow money so that your kids get a piece of the pie?
Right.
When I did take the steps that I needed to. And so, how do you solve that one, right? Like that's a very difficult conversation that couple is going to have to talk through and try to figure out. But again, you don't necessarily think about those things in advance.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, there aren't enough programs like Nacho Kids or the work that Ron's Dill is doing. I can tell you in the financial planning research space, there's pretty much no one else. I mean, there's a couple of folks doing things here and there, but there is a significant gap in research, which is needed to inform training for financial planners, financial therapists, financial counselors. It's needed to inform policies and changes to protect our blended families from a financial well-being perspective. Significant gap.
Mhm.
And it's not one I'm going to be able to fill by myself, right? So it's like I'm begging other people in the industry to start focusing on this because people don't know what they don't know. Financial professionals don't know what they don't know. If they don't
Right.
live in a blended family, it's hard to understand the
Mhm.
differences. I mean, yeah, they know, okay, from a technical perspective, I probably need to do a little bit more on the estate planning side and so forth, but they don't understand the emotions, the complexity, the disagreements and fighting that can occur because everyone naturally wants to take care of their child.
Mm-hmm.
That's biological, right? We can look at things like kin selection theory over in evolutionary biology that say, hey, folks are more willing to engage in altruistic behaviors the more genetically related they are to someone. So I'm more willing to sacrifice for my kids than I am a third cousin.
Yes.
Well, I have no biological relationship with my stepchildren.
Right.
Mhm.
And so, yes, I can develop emotional closeness and all these things, but it's never going to quite make up for the fact that no matter how close we are, that we're just not biologically related. They're not my biological children.
Mhm.
Right.
And so, folks just don't understand that. They don't know how to address that. And
Yeah.
I could go down that rabbit hole all day. So,
Yeah.
Well, it's things that you really should be talking about on your first date.
Your first date? No wonder Branson does what he does.
hey, I'll tell you, you laugh about that. So by Heather and I's third date, and we know from joking about it last time, we had a very short courtship, but in our third date, I said, hey, let's talk about your credit. Now, being in financial planning, I'm going to think that, right? So we did. We shared credit reports. We knew what debt was there. We talked about child support, all those things. But like I said, we still didn't think about, hey, who's going to pay for this or who's going to pay for that or
Car
what
insurance.
cell phones
That's
and
better than
car
what Lori
insurance.
did. Lori made me show her my STD panel.
We did that too. We shared. I mean, we've been married before, so like it's not like.
First of all, I did not. But not surprising if I would have, but still. Yeah, you should cover all these bases.
Yeah.
My son actually asked me one day, he said, what happens if David dies before you? He said, now, granted, we know that's not going to happen. He said, but what if David dies before you? He said, who gets the house? And I said, I do. He said, and then when you die, what happens? I said, well, if I stayed here, then I guess it would go. And I sat there and I was like, to you? Because we haven't talked about what if he dies first? Well, in a way we have, because like this is family land. I probably wouldn't want to live here, kind of thing. But we haven't worked out the details. So I could see if he died first, say I decide to sell the house, then his kids go, well, wait a minute, don't I get something out of that?
Yeah.
And you know as well as we do that when people die, the greed comes out
Oh
like
yeah. Oh
crazy.
yeah. Yeah.
But not saying
Yeah.
these kids are being greedy if they expect something, because I mean it is their parent. It's just like it's convoluted.
Yeah. I'm going to say something. It's going to sound harsh, and I don't mean it that way. But as for all of us, as that are in blended families, as parents, if we don't document and set up with official legal documents using an attorney, not online programs are not sufficient for blended families. If we don't get everything in writing the way it needs to be, we are setting our children up for conflict down the road, because we're going to unintentionally disinherit some kids. There's going to be fighting. There's going to be chaos, madness, all of which we could have prevented to a certain degree by having our legal documents in place. And so, one of the things that there's a gentleman, Dr. Brad Klontz, and we worked on a piece of research that we wrote on the psychology of estate planning for blended families that we published in the Journal of Financial Planning. And in that, we included a couple of exercises. One of them was a role play model for couples to do together. But the other one is a conversation guide specifically about blended families. And there's instructions and everything in the appendix of that article. And that is to help couples have a healthy discussion without fighting, without emotion. It's even got things, hey, if you start to get heated, take a break, right? But just to walk you through, like, what are the things that we need to talk about and think through so that when we do go sit down with the financial planner or the attorney, preferably both, that, we've kind of worked these things out. We know how each other feels, because you also don't want, there's a lot of feelings involved here. I mean, even for a nuclear family, the thought of death and passing on, like there's just a lot of sensitivity around that. But in this case, even more so, right? And you don't want one spouse to feel like you don't love my children as much. You don't love me as much because you want to put everything over here, right? And so it's having that open conversation of, well, tell me how this does make you feel. And why do you feel that way? And let's figure that out, right?
Right.
And so part of that too is thinking back, like, what are my beliefs about money in general? What are my earliest money memories? Like, just when you start to dig back into people, you start to understand, why does my spouse react certain ways when it comes to finances? Why are we always fighting about that? Why are we fighting about the kids? And so you can take this conversation guide, and it was meant for estate planning, but really can be used for any financial type of conversation in a blended family to be able to try to get on the same page. And the spirit behind it is, don't assume the worst in your spouse. Don't assume that they're doing this because they don't love you or because they don't love their kids or whatever. They feel the way that they do about it for a certain reason, just like you do. You've just got to openly talk about that, which is hard to do when it comes to money. So.
Right. Yeah, money's a difficult subject to have with anybody, even if it's your sister that owes you $20.
Yeah.
It's a difficult conversation to have.
Yeah.
It is. It is.
I know we had one lady that she messaged me and she was so upset. She found out that her husband's life insurance policy, he had divvied up between her and his kids. Not her kids. Her kids weren't in it, which she wasn't really worried about that. But she felt like she should get the entire life insurance policy so she could help take care of things around the house and things like that. Because if she only got a portion of it, she'd probably have to sell the house, kind of thing. So that's how she's looking at it. And he's looking at it as, I've got to make sure my kids are taken care of. And she's looking at it like, oh, I don't matter. And he's like, you're an adult. And she's like, well, what's that supposed to mean? So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And that's what it is. It's all emotions. It is. The rational part of our brain just shuts off. And it's completely a 6-year-old basically in there kicking and screaming and making our financial decisions half the time. And that's why we fight with our spouse about money.
Yeah. I know too, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I want to bring this up. My mom did a trust for my niece and nephew. Had it drawn up through an attorney. Nobody thought anything about it until she died, of course. And then I took the trust information to an accountant that we knew. And he's like, this wasn't really set up right. I'm like, what? There were some things that weren't covered that should have been, a few more specifics. So I had to make decisions that I shouldn't have had to make, or I shouldn't
Yeah.
have had to make because it should have been taken care of. So I would suggest, if you, just my own personal suggestion, if you do draw up a trust or something like that and you have an attorney look at it, take it to another attorney just to have them look at it and make sure that everything is covered so there's no gray areas.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. We like to think that the professionals that we're working with are going to set everything up correctly for us, but sometimes that's not the case. And what I've found too, especially being in a blended family, it's hard to find professionals that understand us and understand the complexities. And that's not only in the legal field with things like estate planning, it's obviously in financial planning too, but even in the mental health field, we've tried to do, I think everyone should at least every once in a while engage in some marital counseling. It's just good. It's healthy. It doesn't mean that there's a problem. And, we'd gone to someone that advertised themselves. There's, I won't say the site, but there's a site that puts themselves out there specializing in blended families. And so I went on there and I found a therapist through that said she specialized in blended families. And if I've shared this in the last podcast and people are hearing it again, I apologize, but I was just dumbfounded by it. I mean, it was terrible. She even yelled at us sometimes. It was just like not a good experience, right? And she herself said she lived in a blended family, but it just wasn't a good experience. And so just like this, you've got to find an estate attorney that understands blended families. Not only do they need to be technically sound, right? So they draft the documents up correctly, but you preferably would have someone that can help you navigate through some things. If you haven't been able to work everything out on your own, they're not a mental health professional, but they should still be able to understand the dynamics and the challenges you're facing and be able to help you through that. And sadly, there's not a ton that get that side of it.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah, we had an experience. We took one of David's kids to a therapist, and she supposedly, of course, like you said, had blended family experience, which I'm starting to think that's all a crock because she obviously, I don't even think she had kids really, but she told us that when he did something to stick our tongue out at him, like we were 3. And David and I just looked at each other like, no.
Yeah, I was like, I think we're done here.
Yeah. We're like, we're not going back to that lady. Yeah. That doesn't click well with us. To act like a 3-year-old.
Yeah. Your solution is to stick your tongue out at him.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And from a blended family standpoint, imagine the stepmom sticking her tongue out at the stepkid.
And then the stepkid goes home and tells their other home and tells their biological mom, she stuck her tongue out at me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mine told me to just because I was having some conflict at the time with my daughter, to just let my daughter do whatever she wanted so that she, we could work on repairing that relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Just let her do what she wants. Yeah. And help her. If she wants to shoot up drugs, make sure she has a clean needle. I mean, yeah.
You just, when people don't know, they should just say, I just don't have a clue what to tell you. Instead of just coming up with stuff.
Or say, I don't fully understand this blended dynamic, so let me talk to somebody else that does.
Yeah, something. But
yeah.
I think they just make up stuff just to not be able to, they just don't want to say, I don't have a thing for you.
Well, I was working with this one lady, and her husband had found a therapist for his daughter. Come to find out, she wasn't even a therapist. She's like a student in training. And they'd been going to this girl for like a year.
Oh, gosh.
And the advice she's giving them is horrible.
She's doing her hours for her licensing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the lady's like, if I'd known that, I would have never agreed to this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You definitely have to be careful.
Yeah. Especially with all the, you can get a certification for anything, anywhere anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's hard. It's hard to vet sometimes.
Yeah. Well, we see that sadly in the financial planning field too. So there's actually no title protection right now to call yourself a financial planner. And so what happens is you have people who are really just salespeople. They want to sell you insurance products and investment products, and earn their commissions and so forth, calling themselves, financial planners. But a true financial planner has been through an extensive amount of training, They're not trying to just sell you products and things like that. Like they're creating a plan for you and working with you and so forth. And so unfortunately, consumers don't know the difference. And so they're sometimes unknowingly getting not the best advice, right?
Right.
Well,
It's like when you Google something, you don't know if it's real or not.
yeah, they use the term fiduciary, but is that how do you
No,
know fiduciary?
Okay.
But how do you know if you're dealing with somebody who's a fiduciary?
Well, one thing is if you work with someone that's a certified financial planner,
Uh,
which is there's a CFP board of standards that governs anyone that's a CFP. So for example, I have my CFP. You have a fiduciary obligation if you're a CFP. The thing is sometimes the firms you work for don't operate in a fiduciary capacity, meaning they're just a brokerage firm. They don't have potentially a registered investment advisory firm. And so the firm itself may not have that fiduciary responsibility. And so, there's some difficulty in those situations with really governing that, right?
right.
But if someone is truly a fiduciary, they're a CFP, their firm is a fiduciary, then they do have that obligation. Does it mean that everyone in those situations is doing what they're supposed to? No, but they're supposed to be, right? They have a higher standard that folks that do not operate in a fiduciary capacity do not have.
Right.
When people come to you, what state are you in again?
I'm in Texas.
Texas. That's right. Because I was like, everybody's in Texas. So could you help somebody in South Carolina?
No.
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 So you need to come up with 49 other people that can do blended family financial planning to cover all the states.
Yeah. Well, and it depends too. So it depends on the capacity in which you're working with someone, right? So if I was going to engage in a true financial planning type of engagement or relationship, then I would have to be registered either myself as a registered investment advisory firm in that state until you reach a certain level of what they call assets under management, and then you have to register at the federal level, or be registered in multiple states that way, right? However, if you're providing not financial planning services, but more, let's say, just financial counseling, financial therapy, which is not actually a mental health certification, you could essentially do that across any state. So,
yeah.
And like me right now, personally, I don't do any one-on-one counseling. So what I'm doing is more the research piece and then consulting with firms to try to help them understand this is how you as a planner need to work with blended families.
Okay. So if somebody needed help with financial planning for a blended family in Texas, you could refer them to somebody since you're not doing one-on-one kind of thing right now?
I know people. I can't really give out referrals though. I could say, hey, here's a place to go look.
Right.
Like, for example, go to the Financial Therapy Association website and do the zip code search there to find a financial therapist. If you're trying to work through some of the relational complexities of being in a blended family, right? That intersect with the financial pieces, I'd say go see a financial therapist. If it's more just we've got some financial planning needs overall, we need to figure out our estate planning strategy, some of the more technical stuff. But again, we want them to understand our relational pieces. There's not a website specifically for that, except that I would say on the Financial Therapy Association website, some of them are CFPs and they've been cross-trained in the emotional side. If you want just a CFP though, you go to cfpboard.net and you can look up financial planners in your area that are offering the services. Whether or not they truly understand the blended family side, that's a whole other. Yeah. I don't know them all, so I can't say.
You got to come up with your own certification and membership.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. I've thought about it. We'll create a blended family certification. So
Like
there's a lot involved in that. So
we know.
Yeah. We've been asked to come up with something for therapists for that, and try to certify. And that's just it's a heavy lift right now for us to try to even go down that path.
To even think about it. Yeah. Because it's a
But I
lot.
will clarify so no regulators come after me. I am not a registered investment advisor in any state, including Texas, because I'm not working one-on-one with clients anymore at this point. So,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what are some common challenges that you see that come in? Well, I know you don't do one-on-one anymore, but you still probably hear stories.
Mhm.
What are some common challenges that you see that people can take away from this episode that they may want to go back and talk to their significant other about?
Yeah, I think it's really just being both spouses have to be willing to have the conversation. You have to be willing to sit down, share your feelings, try to keep your emotions in check. And if you can't do that, there's exercises and things out there to help you, like the one I mentioned earlier that's in the journal publication. It could be even just doing things like, hey, write down 10 things that you really appreciate about your spouse, right? So let's fill the love tank before we make withdrawals, right? So write down 10 things you really appreciate about your spouse.
I'll be here all day.
Yeah. And then go write down 5 things. And if we're talking finances specifically, 5 things that you're feeling right now when it comes to our finances. And just make sure it's actually feelings, not I feel like you, but I feel frustrated because we're not able
FBI
to talk
statements.
about these things. Yeah. So actually say your feelings, right? But start with 10 things you appreciate and then 5 things you want to work on, right? So we're making more deposits than withdrawals.
If I went to David and started telling him things I'd appreciate, he'd run. He'd be like, "Oh no,
What
the
do you want?
negative's coming."
What do you want?
Yeah.
No, but
I just bought a pair of shoes. Leave me alone.
yeah. I mean, I know Heather and I have done that too. We've done the 10 and 5, and it gives both people a chance to think about it when you're calm, when you are thinking rationally, make a list, exchange, and then separate. So exchange, give each person maybe even a couple days just to read through it and digest it, and then come back together and talk about those things, right? So there's techniques like that you can do, but the biggest thing is communication, because things are going to come up, and there's going to be things you didn't think about that are going to come up too, because they're just not the everyday things, right?
Right.
And then also if you're going to have kids that aren't driving yet, but they're going to be driving at some point, right? Start having the conversations now. What's this going to look like? Who's going to pay for the insurance? Whose insurance are they going to go on? Because there's liability with that.
Does the car go back and forth between the two homes?
Exactly. That was part of our conversation, because we've got a 16 and a 17-year-old, right? And it's like, okay, well, if we're putting them on our insurance and we're taking the liability there and the risk, right? If he has an accident, that's our insurance going up. If we're going to buy the car and all that, then why should they get the benefit at the other house, right? But then the other side of that is, why should the child be penalized, right? Because of that. And so you've just got to talk through these things. Sometimes you got to talk with the exes, right? And you've just got to figure those things out. But if you're not already having those conversations because you're like, oh, my kids are 5 and 6, I would still start having them now, because you're going to get there. It's going to happen. It's going to sneak up on you before you know it. College funding, start talking through that type of stuff if the kids are still younger. And then for those blended families, where this is for all blended families, so even those with young children, but also those maybe with grown children. So I'm technically, I have a stepmom, but I've never really thought of her that way. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just because my dad married her 10 years ago. I'm a grown man. I've never lived with her,
Right.
so.
She's your dad's wife.
That's a relationship. Yeah, it's my dad's wife. It's Linda.
Yeah.
But and she's sweet as can be. But I just never thought of her like that, because we've never had that kind of relationship. And but so even if it's an older blended family, an adult blended family, or a young blended family, you need to be having those estate planning conversations like we talked about. What do you want? Heather, what do you want to have happen when you pass away? And she's going to say, Michael, what do you want to have happen when you pass away, right? And then you start to kind of negotiate, so to speak, until you reach an agreement that you both feel comfortable with. And then you share that agreement with the kids.
Right.
Well, they may or may not like it, but they need to know, hey, this is the agreement. This is what we've come up with, right?
Yeah, let them go through the emotions before you die.
Yeah. Don't have them fighting over it later.
Yeah.
Like, let's
set the expectation. There's no surprises.
Right.
Right, right. But yeah, any scenario and every scenario you can think of, from college, car insurance, to hopefully later in life, but none of us know when things will happen, right? And when we can pass away. That's why you can't wait.
Mm-hmm.
Have those conversations. Who's going to be the beneficiary on my life insurance? Who gets the house, when we pass away? And if you're in a community property state like I am, it just complicates things a little more. There's other rules there, but just start having those conversations. What do you want to have happen? You don't have to figure out how to make it happen. Don't overcomplicate things for yourself. That's why there's financial planners. That's why there's attorneys. They can figure out the technical piece, but what do you want to have happen? And, do that. Because a lot of times folks will freeze and not take action because they don't know what to do. But you do know how you feel.
Right.
And you do know what you want. Maybe not right away, but if you sit down and think about it, you'll figure out what you want. And that's where you bring in the professionals to figure out how to actually execute it.
I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer it or not. So say that David's creating a will, and he says, if I die before Lori gets the house. If Lori dies before me, then this happens. Can you do that? Have like if-then kind of statements in a will? So for instance, David could say, if I die before Lori, she gets the house. When she dies, can he say what I have to do with that house? You know what I'm saying? Like, he needs to split this with my kids. And
yeah, you can put essentially your wishes into a will. Now, keep in mind with the will that a will is different than a trust. So a will is still going to go through probate. It can be contested. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean those contesting will win, but it can be contested. Trusts are more expensive. Mm-hmm. Let's just be honest. If you have an attorney draw up a trust, it's typically going to cost more. Most people think of trust as being once you have lots of assets, right?
Right.
In a blended family, there's a valid reason for having a trust before then, because you can control that. You can say exactly how you want everything to be, and then everything can stay in that trust after you pass. Now, so you kind of control it from your grave, right? You can put provisions in your will to have that trust established upon your death. And so that can work as well. But, the trade-off there is you're basically relying then on your surviving spouse to have to go deal with all the complications of getting it set up later.
Right.
Because then they got to take the will and they got to follow the process, right? And get everything established versus while you're both alive, let's go ahead and work together to get all this set up and in place. Mm-hmm. You're still going to have to update it. You should review estate documents every 3 to 5 years if nothing changes. If things change, then more often than that, right?
And that's something that a lot of people don't know. They never update them.
Yeah. Yeah. You need to review it. I mean, if nothing needs to change, great. But laws change and things change, right? And so you do want to go back and review those. And, particularly when you think of blended families too, like I think we talked about this last time, but, there's something called the step family cycle, right? Mm-hmm. From Papernell.
Yep.
And it's basically just the premise behind it is you're forming, storming, and norming as a family, right? Like we say in the corporate world, forming, storming, and norming. And so early on, you're going to be in that honeymoon phase. And if you set up your estate documents then, that might look one way. 3 years in, and you realize things aren't so peachy anymore. Things aren't so great. Actually, I can't even stand that person. Hopefully that's not the case, but right. You may say, I don't want them getting that much anymore. That's going to change. Mm-hmm. And then, on average, families get through that cycle after 7 years completely. And then, of course, sometimes you slip back and so forth. So at 7 years, it may look even different than that. And so you got to keep that in mind as well. Things change. But that can happen in a nuclear family too. Things change. But the difference in the biological family is especially when it comes to the stepchildren, you're relying on emotional relationships to have that bond. Mm-hmm. And emotional relationships can change.
Right.
Whereas with your own biological family, you've got that connection. So,
yeah. I know when my mom passed away, we had her will, but we also had handwritten revisions that she had placed in there with them. Now, my dad dealt with the probate stuff. I didn't have to deal with that. Even though they were divorced, he dealt with the probate stuff. But we were like, well, you could tell who she was mad at this day because it changed. You could tell somebody had made her mad because they were no longer in that will or that, letter. And then 6 months later, she must have made up with them because they were back in it. So I don't suggest changing it when you're emotional like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But now with the scenario I suggested with David, with if Lori gets the house, blah, 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 after that, that's more of a trust, right? Because the house would go into a trust for me and I could live here until I died. Then it would be split between his kids or whatever.
You can't bring in those sugar daddies.
Yeah, I mean, potentially, if you wanted to, you could do, like, for example, I'm not recommending this because everyone's situation is different, but for Heather and I, we set up a living revocable trust, right?
Mhm.
And so that means we can change those provisions if we want to, but we put the deed to our house in the living revocable trust. And so everything, all the provisions, everything are set up in there. So whether I die first, she dies first, we die at the same time, everything is spelled out in that trust as far as how the house will be then owned, who it will pass to, and so forth, right?
Yeah.
It's like here in Texas, our property is community property. So Heather we bought this house after we were married. So Heather owns 50% and I own 50% of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And so within the trust, we can say, okay, well, upon my death, Heather still obviously continues to enjoy the house, but upon her death, here's what's going to happen, right? My half is going to go this way and her half is going to go that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just allows us more control. A trust gives you a lot of control. Yes, when you have lots of wealth, you can do all these different things for, trying to minimize estate taxes and so forth. But within a blended family, we use it. You can use them also for that control piece, right? And making sure that everyone's children are taken care of the way that they should be. Spouses are taken care of the way that they should be. Like, for example, you can say, okay, these assets over here, they're going to go to my kid. But until Heather passes, she's allowed to take the income off of those investments.
Right.
So she can continue to use the income up to a certain amount,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you can put that in there as well. And that way you make sure there's still something left for your own kids once your spouse passes away as well, right?
Right.
Or I can say, hey, I want, $100,000, whatever, I'm making numbers up, to go to each kid as soon as I die. Everything else goes into this now what becomes an irrevocable trust arrangement. And, again, Heather can take income off of that, but as soon as she passes, my kids get their part, right? And then she can do the same thing over for her side.
Right.
And same type of thing. So it just gives you a lot more control, and trusts don't go through probate and so forth. So it can speed up that process and make things a little easier as well when someone passes. So
I do want to stress the importance of, if you are in a blended family, that you do have a will that takes, or a trust that takes into consideration, if you die, that if you don't specify it, the house could go to the kids. Say, for instance, there's a couple that's living together, but they're not married, right? So they don't have the wife-husband dynamics of the wife gets what the husband had, right? So if they're just living together and one of them dies, that person could be put out on the street by those stepkids.
yeah, if you're cohabiting, there's obviously some risk there if you don't have any ownership in the home and that type of thing, and that's a consideration. The other side of that too makes me think that part of what I mentioned earlier about we need more research to inform policies, right? And protect. I mean, obviously in the cohabiting situation, like you just mentioned, but even if they are married and they're legally a blended family with step parents and stepchildren, if you start to form a relationship with your stepchildren and their biological parent that you're married to passes, I mean, yes, you can put in your will, these are my wishes, and I would like for them to still have time with them and so forth. But they're
It's not legally binding.
Yeah, unless there's something wrong with the other biological parent, and you can prove it, they're good luck. They're going to get their child. And if they don't like you, and let's be honest, we don't always like our spouse's exes, and they don't always like you either, right? And they say, no, I'm sorry, Caitlin, you can't see Heather anymore.
All right.
That's that. There's nothing to protect the step parent.
Right.
And that's unfortunate, especially considering how much of the population now is a blended family and not all blended families are formed out of divorces. So I don't mean to imply that, but a good majority are, right?
Yeah.
And or if they weren't married, it's a pass fail relationship essentially in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of all the divorces, because of the remarriage rate, because of the fact that each subsequent marriage, the divorce rate actually increases even more, right? We see more and more and more blended families. The dynamics have changed considerably across our nation, across the world for that matter.
Right.
And yet societal norms and laws all favor traditional families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know when I went to draw up my will, I was talking to the attorney and he said, I have a child, and he said, well, the child will automatically go to the dad. And I said, what if I don't want that? He said, you can put it in your will as your wishes, and it is given some consideration, but that doesn't mean, like if I said David gets Jackson, it doesn't mean he automatically gets Jackson. He'd have to fight for him, but they could use my will saying, the mother requested this to kind of, as quote, quote, evidence, I guess you could say, to kind of make a persuasion. Yeah.
Yeah, you could potentially, depending on the state and the judge and those things, maybe you get some visitation rights, but there's nothing written in the law that guarantees you get anything. It's going to be the other biological parents' rights. So that typically are going to take place there. But I don't know. There's so much opportunity right now for understanding us better, right? Our families.
Mm-hmm.
We're just behind.
Yeah.
And there's some research. Give you all a little advanced peek here. I've got an article that's getting ready to publish in the Journal of Financial Therapy. Probably by the time this airs, it'll be published. But it's on financial infidelity, specifically in blended families.
Ooh.
And I will say,
is that like when somebody buys shoes and don't tell you about it?
Yeah, it's dishonest behaviors with your spouse. Yeah. So I think that happened. But yeah, when you're spending, you're hiding money, you're doing these different things behind your spouse.
That was for you.
Yeah. So that's financial infidelity is what that is. But now, granted, the sample size is not the largest, but what I saw in that is that the rate of financial infidelity is higher in blended families and nuclear families.
Yep.
And I was able to kind of intersect that with emotional fusion, which emotional fusion it's a term from family systems theory, and it just basically says, hey, the whole family is one big interconnected emotional unit. And when you're emotionally fused, you have a hard time separating your emotions essentially from everyone else in the family, right?
Right.
And so that can cause obviously some issues and relational conflict and increased anxiety and all these things. So when that's present, it just makes the probability of financial infidelity occurring that much more likely, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so that's some interesting research that'll be coming out. Some other stuff that super ahead sneak peek, because I'm still even developing this right now and digging into the information, but I've been looking at some of the data in what's called the Health and Retirement Study, which is a huge study. It's done every 2 years. There's 50,000 or so respondents, and they've been following these same families. They've been using the same method since 1996.
Oh, wow.
So tons of data, right? And I've been looking at wealth differences between blended and nuclear families, transfers during lifetime, differences between parents and their own children versus stepchildren, transfers after death, being named in a trust or a will or a life insurance beneficiary, like differences between biological and stepchildren. So everyone in this is 50 and older. And actually the average age, even for the children at this point, is 50 and older. And so they're all adult blended families, but there is absolutely a difference, in what we see as far as wealth being passed, assets being transferred. And there's all kinds of factors for that. It's not necessarily just that I'm a stepchild and you're a biological child, right? So when we do these studies, we control for all these other variables like income and race and gender, and we can control for all these different factors. But there is some, for my research people that listen, there's some statistical significance there in the differences, even when controlling for other things. So I'm excited about that research. I'm not excited about the results necessarily.
Yeah.
I'm excited about the research because, again, we've got to get that awareness out there. Well, part of that is, there are studies that show family instability which if you've been divorced and remarried, that's family instability. There's all kinds of negative impacts to our children when it comes to their education, their mental health, and so forth. But there's negative impacts on the wealth side too. Some of that goes back to the evolutionary biology, right? The kin selection piece, where I just don't want to give my stepchildren the same money I give my biological children, right? So purely from a biological perspective, that means less assets being transferred on. That means less generational wealth being passed on. That means a blended family is right off the bat at a disadvantage compared to a nuclear family, because and there's generally more people. Like on average, there's more kids and all that, right? So even if you do pass it on, it's split up more, right? And so there are long-term negative impacts being caused by family instability beyond just the immediate things that we see. It's taking its toll generation to generation to generation down the line, right?
Right.
And so, it's not necessarily surprising, but it's not out there, right?
Yeah.
And so we need that research. We need to inform the right people, the right policymakers, and so forth with that. So
yeah.
So die broke. spend that inheritance so you don't have to leave anything to your kids.
That's what my daddy says. I'm dying, not leaving anybody anything. I'm like, well, you done gave everybody else everything. What about me?
It is interesting. Like, I had a conversation with my parents. It's been a few years ago, but there were some things they were saying in the conversation about how they were putting back stuff or making decisions so that we would have inheritance, we being me and my sister. And I was like, don't do that. Like, go and enjoy your life while you can. I don't care if you leave me anything. Just don't leave me a mess. That's all I ask.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a different, maybe you would know better than me, but I think that's a different mindset than people have now. I don't hear a lot of people talking about what I'm going to leave my kids. In fact, I hear people talking about what they're going to leave their grandkids. They completely skip generations.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm that way. Like, I want to make sure that I leave a fair amount of wealth to my kids, and that can go to their kids, my grandkids, and so forth, right? But, some of the more traditional, like, economic theories, they talk about what's called expected utility. Well, utility is basically, probably a simplified way to say that is your happiness, right? Mm-hmm. And so a rational human being would spend everything they have, up until they die, to not overspend, right? But spend down all their wealth in their retirement years so that they have a higher utility, because by doing so, they're going to enjoy every bit of their life, right? What that doesn't take into account is the human side of it, the emotional side of it, that assumes perfect rationality, right? Well, the human side of it is, for some of us, we are maximizing our utility, our happiness, increasing that value by leaving something behind,
right,
to our children or our grandchildren, because that's important to us. Some people it's important, some it's not, right? But that's again where the kind of the human side and the psychology side comes in, because those traditional ways of doing things, those traditional economic theories, traditional financial planning, they just assume everyone's rational. Doesn't make. I mean, I'm a financial planner and I do stupid stuff with money all the time, right? Like, we're just, we're not rational. So.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I think people are mostly irrational. It always reminds, when somebody uses that term, I always think of the book Predictably Irrational. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's.
I haven't read that one, no. But.
Yeah, it's very good. It's a very good read, but I recommend it. But it just talks about how people can can act irrationally, and they have certain behaviors which are predictable, that they can predict that somebody will act irrationally based on statistics in certain circumstances. And it's a good read. You being someone who, studies that type of behavior would probably enjoy it.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. So I'll have to check that out.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you invited me back again, and I didn't scare you off the first time. So I'm glad to be back on here. And like I said, I love the purpose and focus of Nacho Kids, and we definitely need this. All families need something, especially blended families, to help us be able to communicate better with our spouses and have healthy relationships.
Yep. And we appreciate what you're doing too.
Yeah, because now I got to go have a talk with Lori about her financial infidelity.
Wait, I'm not trying to cause arguments here. Come on.
All right, Michael, we're going to have you back to be a therapist for me and David. Talking about financial infidelity.
Yeah, it's always funny because she buys herself stuff for our occasions. So Christmas is coming up, anniversary's coming up, and quite frankly, I prefer that because it takes the pressure off of me to go find something that I think that she's going to like. So she always comes up and says, "Oh, by the way, this is what you got me for our anniversary, or this is what you got me for Christmas."
There you go.
Well, we were recording we're doing a guided change your thinking challenge right now. And we were recording some of the content for it. And at the end, I'm like, I need to tell you, I bought a pair of flu vogs. And he's like, what? I'm like, I bought a pair of flu vog shoes. So this lady, it's all started with the blended family thing. I went to a conference in Texas and I saw a lady with these shoes and I'm like, I love those. And she's like, they're flu vogs. So she introduced me to flu vog shoes. Some of them are very outrageous, but they are not cheap shoes. And David didn't realize how much they cost until we went to an actual store when we were in Denver. And he's like, and I'm like, oh no, I only shopped the sale page. So see, that's partial infidelity, right?
They were only $180, not $200, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But, I like to say oftentimes that I don't spend, and this might be typical of men, even though I wouldn't put all men in the same bucket, but we don't spend often, but when we do, boy, do we spend big.
This is true. I'm not and Heather and I, fortunately, we're pretty much on the same page with money. Maybe why we had a short courtship early on, because she said, hey, instead of spending all this money on a wedding, why don't we just go have the pastor marry us in the den at church? Okay. I'm like, so the right one. We're very much aligned in that way, but she'll do more of the little everyday kind of spending, right? Mm-hmm. Which we have allowance accounts on that. And so she's great about that. We don't go over budget and things, but I'm definitely one of those where I'll just let my allowance build up and then I go buy something big. So I don't spend money very often, but when I do, it's big. So
that's it.
Yeah. See, I buy shoes and you buy a 8-car garage.
Yeah. I mean, she buys a fancy printer and I put $14,000 worth of brick pavers in the backyard. So,
there's always something. Always something. But we appreciate having you on again, and maybe we can have you back again.
We'd love to, and even without Heather, but we would love to get Heather on here too.
Yeah. See if we can do it. But I'd love to be back. So
once you get a couple more of those research papers done, we can circle back and talk about those as well, and shoot Lori a link to them so we can put them on the website and add them to the show notes and stuff like that.
That'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely do that. So
and actually the guy that we deal with for our financial planning, I'm going to mention this to him. Okay. Say, what do you know about blended families? I know he knows about us.
Yeah.
But I'm going to talk to him about the fact that he needs to understand more about the blended family thing.
So my stepkid don't get none of my stuff.
All right, Michael, we'll let you go before we have to use David's wheel.
Okay, think so.
All right. Talk to you later.
Thanks. I'm so glad that Michael is working to help blended families with financial planning because people don't get it. It's not as simple as, oh, they're your kids too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff, like you and I talked about. You moved into the home that I had. And at that point, you started contributing to the mortgage for this home. So it would be understandable if my kids look at it and say, if something ever happens to dad, then, we get the home or whatever. But that's not what's going to happen. You get it. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, what about Jackson? And, because you've contributed financially into this home. So, there should be some benefit if you wanted to pass on some portion of that to Jackson as your son, then that should be something that's there. And so there's a lot, for us to think through and try to figure out how to do that. And as I'm saying that, I keep hearing this little voice in the back of my head going, it's never going to be fair. It's never going to be fair.
No, it's not. It's not. But we'll figure it out.
Yeah, we will. But that's the whole point of this conversation, though, with him, though, is that it does give you things to think about that you need to talk about and figure out together.
Right. Yep. And if you can't figure it out together, you can go to like a financial therapist.
Yeah, I didn't know those things existed. Those people exist.
I know. Just like a lot of people don't know that we exist.
Financial therapist. So, yeah, that's interesting. Maybe that's what I'll do when I retire.
There you go. All right, folks, don't forget, if you are in or near Scottsdale, Arizona, December 7th, come see us, man.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor Day.
Yeah.
We celebrate.
Shoot me an email at lori@nachokids.com, and that's LORI @NACHOKIDS.com.
All right. That's our show for today, folks. Be sure to join us again next week. And remember, life is good
when you nacho.